The Whistle That Summoned the Dead, a Mr. James story. Among the papers left by my late colleague, Dr. Edmund Wainwright of St. Bartholomew's College, Cambridge, I discovered a manuscript which I believe merits preservation, though its contents have given me considerable pause. I had known Wainwright for the better part of 30 years, first as my tutor when I was an undergraduate reading history, and later as a colleague when I returned to St. Bartholomew's as a fellow. Throughout our long acquaintance, I never knew him to be anything other than the most rigorous and level-headed of scholars. His work on medieval ecclesiastical administration, while perhaps dry to the general reader, was considered definitive in our field. He was, in short, the last man in England whom one would expect to produce a document of the nature I am about to transcribe. The manuscript was found in a locked drawer of his desk, wrapped first in oilcloth, then in brown paper, and sealed with red wax bearing the impression of his signet ring. Attached to the package was a note in his careful hand, to be opened only after my death. I have set down these facts as accurately as memory permits, though I wish to God I had never occasion to learn them. Let the reader judge whether I have been the victim of delusion, or whether, as I believe, there are things in this world that scholarship would do better to leave undisturbed. E.W. The 15th of November 1923. The events he describes took place in the autumn of 1922, when Wainwright accepted an invitation to catalogue the library of Helmstone Priory in Suffolk. The Priory, as those familiar with East Anglian history will know, was a Benedictine foundation dating from the reign of Henry II, partially destroyed during the dissolution, rebuilt as a private residence in the Tudor period, and subsequently much altered. Its library was rumored to contain several unique manuscripts that had somehow survived the depredations of Thomas Cromwell's commissioners, including a chronicle of the priory's history written by one of its last monks. What Wainwright found at Helmstone was indeed a chronicle, though not of the sort he expected. His account of those weeks in Suffolk makes for disturbing reading, all the more so because of the measured, scholarly tone in which it is written. I have decided to present it here exactly as he wrote it, adding only these prefatory remarks and a few notes where his references might be obscure to the modern reader. Whether the reader believes his account or dismisses it as the product of overwork and isolation is a matter I leave to individual judgment. I will say only that Edmund Wainwright was not a man given to exaggeration, and that certain facts which I have been able to verify independently suggest that something very unusual did indeed occur at Helmstone Priory in the autumn of 1922. Dr. Edmund Wainwright was, at the time of these events, 43 years of age, unmarried, and wholly devoted to his scholarly pursuits. He had taken his degree at St. Bartholomew's with the highest honors, spent a year studying manuscripts in Rome and Paris, and returned to Cambridge to take up a fellowship that he would hold until his death. His rooms in the Pepys building overlooked the college gardens, and it was there, surrounded by his books and papers, that he was happiest. Those who knew him only professionally might have thought him a dry stick of a man, interested in nothing beyond the dating of charters and the intricacies of monastic land tenure. This was not entirely unfair, but it was incomplete. Wainwright had a keen appreciation for architecture, particularly of the medieval period, and could speak with genuine eloquence about the play of light through Gothic windows, or the mathematical precision of fan vaulting. He was also, though few knew this, an accomplished pianist, who would sometimes, late in the evening, play Bach's fugues with a precision that matched his scholarship. Physically, he was unremarkable, of medium height and build, with sandy hair that had begun to thin at the crown, and pale blue eyes that peered with mild curiosity through wire-rimmed spectacles. His dress was conservative even by Cambridge standards, dark suits of good but not ostentatious quality, white shirts whose collars were always properly starched, and a rotating selection of college ties. His only concession to personal taste was a rather fine gold watch that had belonged to his father, which he wore on a chain across his waistcoat. His daily routine was as precise as his scholarship. He rose each morning at 6:30, took a cold bath, a habit acquired at school and never abandoned, and breakfasted on porridge, toast and China tea while reading his correspondence. By 8 o'clock he was at his desk, where he would remain, with only brief interruptions for meals, until 10 in the evening. His only regular diversions were his evening music. His pipe he favored a Virginia tobacco that filled his rooms with a sweet, heavy smoke, and long walks through the countryside around Cambridge, during which he would mentally organize his research or puzzle over some problematic passage in a medieval text. It was this very regularity of habit that made the invitation to Helmstone Priory so appealing. For years, Wainwright had been working on a comprehensive history of Benedictine houses in East Anglia, and the Helmstone Library was known to contain documents unavailable elsewhere. The previous librarian, a local antiquary named Josiah Morse, had been notoriously protective of the collection, allowing access to very few scholars. His sudden death from a stroke in the summer of 1922 had left the library in considerable disorder, and the trustees were anxious to have it properly catalogued before deciding whether to sell the collection or maintain it intact. Helmstone Priory stood in that part of Suffolk where the land begins its long, gentle descent toward the fens, a country of wide skies and distant horizons, where church towers serve as landmarks, and the wind moves through the wheat fields like waves across water. The nearest village was Helmstone St. Mary, 3 miles distant by a road that had probably followed the same course since Saxon times. The railway station was at Wickham Market, 7 miles away, necessitating a cab journey through increasingly isolated countryside. Wainwright made this journey on the afternoon of October 3rd, 1922. A Tuesday that had begun bright but was clouding over as his train pulled into Wickham Market. The station master had arranged for a cab, driven by a taciturn man named Hedges, who seemed to know without being told that his passenger was bound for the Priory. As they drove through the gathering dusk, Wainwright attempted conversation, asking about the history of the area, and the Priory in particular. Hedges's responses were monosyllabic, until Wainwright mentioned that he had come to work in the library, at which point the driver turned to look at him with an expression of what seemed like concern. "You'll be staying at the Priory, then?" Hedges asked. "Yes, for several weeks, I expect. The trustees have arranged rooms for me." Hedges was silent for a moment, then added, "Mr. Morse. He stayed there too, toward the end." "Did you know Mr. Morse?" "Everyone knew Mr. Morse, sir. 30 years he worked in that library. 30 years, and then—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "His death was very sudden, I understand." "Sudden, yes, but not unexpected, if you take my meaning. Not after he found— Well, it's not for me to say, sir. Mrs. Jennings up at the house. She'll see you're comfortable." No amount of gentle prodding could extract from Hedges what exactly Morse had found, and they completed the journey in silence. The approach to the Priory was along a drive lined with elms, their branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel of increasing darkness. When they emerged, the building itself was before them, a complex architectural puzzle in the failing light. The original Priory church stood to the north, its ruins dark against the evening sky, while the inhabited portions of the building spread irregularly to the south and east, Tudor brick mingling with medieval stone, Georgian windows punched through ancient walls. Mrs. Jennings was waiting at the main entrance, a lamp in her hand, despite the fact that it was not yet fully dark. She was a woman of about 60, with the kind of substantial presence that suggested competence in all practical matters. Her greeting was cordial but formal, and she led Wainwright through a bewildering sequence of corridors and staircases to his rooms, in what she called the Tudor wing. "Mr. Blackwood, that's the owner, sir. He's away on the continent," she explained as they walked. "But he's left instructions that you're to have everything you need. These were Mr. Morse's rooms when he stayed here. I hope that won't disturb you." "Not at all," Wainwright assured her, though he noticed a slight hesitation in her manner as she opened the door. The rooms were more spacious than he had expected. A bedroom with dark oak paneling, and a carved four-poster bed, and a sitting room furnished with leather chairs, and a writing desk, positioned to catch the morning light. Most convenient of all, a door connected directly to the library, saving him the necessity of navigating the Priory's confusing passages. "Dinner is at 7, sir, in the small dining room. I'll send Mary to show you the way. Breakfast at whatever hour suits you. Is there anything else you require?" Wainwright assured her that everything was satisfactory, and Mrs. Jennings departed, leaving him to unpack and settle in. As he arranged his books and papers on the desk, he became aware of the profound quiet of the place. Cambridge could be quiet, especially during the long vacation, but this was different, a positive presence of silence rather than a mere absence of noise. Through the window he could see the ruins of the Priory church, its empty windows black rectangles against the darkening sky. The following morning, Wainwright began his work in earnest. The library was even more impressive by daylight than it had appeared during his brief inspection the previous evening. The room occupied what had been the Priory's refectory, a vast stone hall perhaps 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a hammer-beam ceiling that disappeared into shadow even on the brightest days. The windows, which had been glazed during the Tudor renovations, were of clear glass divided by stone mullions, and admitted a steady, even light that was perfect for reading. The books themselves were arranged with no discernible system. Medieval manuscripts stood next to Victorian novels. Scientific treatises of the Enlightenment rubbed shoulders with devotional works of the Counter-Reformation. It was clear that successive owners had simply added their books wherever space could be found, and that Mr. Morse's attempts at organization had been, at best, partial. Wainwright decided to begin with a general survey, making notes on the contents of each shelf before attempting any reorganization. It was slow work, but deeply satisfying. By the end of the first week, he had identified several manuscripts of considerable interest, including a 15th-century Book of Hours with unusually fine illuminations, and what appeared to be an autograph letter from Thomas Cranmer. It was on the Tuesday of his second week, October 10th, that he made the discovery that would prove so significant. He was working in the northeastern corner of the library, a particularly dark area where the shelves were deepest and the books most disordered. Behind a row of 18th-century sermons, he found a small wooden box, about 6 inches square and 3 inches deep, made of oak that had darkened almost to black with age. The box was locked, but the lock was of a simple medieval type that yielded easily to one of the keys on the ring Mrs. Jennings had given him. Inside, wrapped in what had once been red silk, but was now faded to a dusty pink, was an object that made Wainwright's heart beat faster with scholarly excitement. It was a whistle, about 4 inches long, made of what appeared to be bone or ivory that had yellowed with age. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The surface was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as he turned it in the light. But it was the inscription that truly caught his attention. Running around the mouthpiece in letters so small he needed his magnifying glass to read them clearly, was a Latin phrase, qui me sonuerit, mortuos suscitabit. He who sounds me shall raise the dead. Wainwright sat back in his chair, the whistle heavy in his hand. Medieval inscriptions of this type were not uncommon. One thought immediately of the Horn of Roland, with its boastful claims, but there was something about this particular object that seemed different. The carving was not Christian in character. The patterns reminded him more of Celtic, or even older work he had seen in museums, and the Latin, while grammatically correct, had an archaic quality that suggested a very early date. He examined the box more carefully and found, carved into the inside of the lid, what appeared to be a date 1539, the year of the dissolution. Someone, presumably one of the last monks of Helmstone, had hidden this object as the king's commissioners approached. But why? What was so important about an old whistle that it needed to be preserved when so much else was being destroyed? There were no documents with the whistle, nothing to indicate its provenance or purpose. Wainwright made detailed notes, including a sketch of the inscription and the carved patterns, then carefully rewrapped the object and returned it to its box. He would need to research this further, but his first priority was to continue with the general catalogue. Still, throughout the rest of that day, his thoughts kept returning to the whistle and its disturbing inscription. That evening at dinner, Wainwright decided to make some casual inquiries. Mrs. Jennings had joined him, as had become her custom when Mr. Blackwood was away. She seemed to feel it improper for a guest to dine alone, though her own manner remained formally correct. The housemaid, Mary, served a simple but well-prepared meal of roast mutton with vegetables from the kitchen garden. "I made an interesting discovery today," Wainwright began, after they had discussed the weather unseasonably cold for October, and the news from London. The political situation remained troubled. A small medieval artifact, hidden behind some books, a whistle of all things, with a rather curious inscription. Mrs. Jennings' fork paused halfway to her mouth. "A whistle, sir?" "Yes, made of bone or ivory, I believe. Quite old. The inscription is in Latin, something about raising the dead. Medieval craftsmen did have a taste for the dramatic." "Where did you find it, exactly?" There was something in her tone that made Wainwright look at her more carefully. Her face, usually pleasantly neutral, showed signs of genuine concern. "In the northeast corner of the library, behind some sermon collections. It was in a wooden box, probably hidden during the dissolution." Mrs. Jennings set down her fork entirely. "Mr. Morse found something in that corner just before his illness. He was very excited about it, spent days researching. Then one morning, perhaps a week before he died, he came down looking terrible. White as a sheet, hands shaking, said he'd been working too hard, needed rest. But, he moved out of those rooms, sir. The ones you're in now, went back to his cottage in the village, said the priory didn't agree with him anymore. 3 days later, he was dead. The death certificate listed a stroke, I believe." "Yes, sir. But old Dr. Harrington, he said he'd never seen a stroke leave a man looking like that." The expression on his face, she shuddered slightly. "Well, it's not pleasant dinner conversation. I'm sure it's just coincidence." Mary, who had been clearing plates, suddenly spoke up, which was so unusual that both Wainwright and Mrs. Jennings turned to look at her. "My gran knew about the whistle," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The monk's whistle," she called it, said they used it during the Black Death. "Mary," Mrs. Jennings's tone was sharp, "don't fill Dr. Wainwright's head with village nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Mary protested, with more spirit than Wainwright would have expected from the usually timid girl. "Gran said her gran told her, and she had it from her gran before that. When the pestilence came, the monks would blow the whistle to call back the spirits of the dead, to ask them who would die next, but something went wrong. The dead didn't want to go back." "That's quite enough," Mrs. Jennings said firmly. "Dr. Wainwright doesn't want to hear old wives' tales. Do you, sir?" In fact, Wainwright was deeply interested, but he recognized that Mrs. Jennings would put a stop to any further revelations from Mary. "Local folklore can be quite illuminating," he said diplomatically. "Often there's a grain of historical truth buried in these old stories. But I'm sure you're right, Mrs. Jennings, one mustn't take them too seriously." The conversation turned to other matters, but Wainwright noticed that Mrs. Jennings seemed distracted for the rest of the meal, and Mary, when she brought the coffee, avoided meeting his eyes entirely. That night, Wainwright found sleep elusive. The wind had risen, and the old building was full of sounds, creaks and groans that were doubtless perfectly normal in a structure of such age and complexity, but seemed, in the small hours of the morning, to suggest movement where no movement should be. Several times he thought he heard footsteps in the library next door, but when he listened more carefully, the sound resolved itself into the settling of ancient timbers or the scratch of ivy against the windows. He must have dozed eventually, because he woke suddenly with the distinct impression that someone had called his name. The room was dark, the fire having died to embers, and for a moment he lay still listening. There it was again, not his name, exactly, but a sound like distant whistling, a tune he almost recognized but couldn't quite place. It seemed to be coming from the library. Wainwright lit a candle. The priory had gas lighting in the main rooms, but not in the bedrooms, and made his way to the connecting door. The library was a cave of shadows, his small circle of candlelight seeming only to emphasize the darkness beyond. The whistling had stopped, and the room was silent, except for his own breathing and the tap of rain against the windows. He was about to return to bed when he noticed that the box containing the whistle which he had left on the reading table was open. He was certain he had closed and locked it before leaving the library that evening. Moving closer, he saw that the whistle itself had been unwrapped and lay exposed on its bed of faded silk. Moreover, and this made him doubt his own senses, it appeared to be warm to the touch, as if someone had recently handled it. Wainwright rewrapped the whistle, locked the box, and after a moment's thought took it back to his bedroom, placing it in the drawer of his bedside table. He told himself that he must have forgotten to lock it properly, that the warmth was his imagination, that the whistling had been the wind in the chimneys. But sleep, when it finally came, was troubled by dreams of long corridors filled with shadowy figures, all moving toward some terrible appointment he could not quite remember. The next morning brought sunshine and a return of common sense. Wainwright almost laughed at his midnight fancies as he dressed and breakfasted. The whistle, when he examined it again by daylight, was simply an interesting medieval artifact, nothing more. He returned it to the library and spent a productive day cataloguing, though he found himself occasionally glancing toward the corner where the box sat, innocent-looking in the afternoon sun. It was that evening, as he was preparing for bed, that he experienced something that could not be so easily dismissed. He was at his washstand, splashing cold water on his face, when he heard, quite distinctly, 3 long, low notes from what could only be a whistle. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with a resonance that made his teeth ache. And then, as the last note died away, he heard something else, a sound like many feet walking slowly, rhythmically, as in a procession. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace and yanked open the door to the library. The room was empty, silent, filled with the last gray light of dusk. The box containing the whistle was exactly where he had left it, still locked, but on the floor in front of it was a single footprint in what appeared to be mud, though it had not rained since morning, and the library windows were all secure. The next day, Wainwright decided to conduct serious research into the whistle's history. The Priory's library, he had discovered, included a substantial collection of documents relating to the monastery's history, including account rolls, charters, and what appeared to be a chronicle kept by successive generations of monks. Most of these were in Latin, some in Norman French, and a few in Middle English. His expertise in medieval paleography served him well as he began to piece together references to the whistle. The earliest mention he found was in an account roll from 1348, the year the Black Death reached England. The entry was brief but suggestive. Item pro uno fistula ebernia, ad convocandum defunctos, ESVID. An ivory whistle for summoning the dead, purchased for 2 shillings and 6 pence. This was followed by a note in a different hand. Non utendum nisi in extremis, not to be used except in extremity. The chronicle provided more detail, though the relevant pages were damaged by water and difficult to read. The chronicler, writing in 1349, described how the then prior, desperate to know which of his monks would survive the pestilence, had acquired a whistle of ancient providence, said to have power over the boundary between life and death. The prior had used it on the Feast of All Souls, summoning those who had passed beyond to reveal the future. What happened next was described in language that suggested the chronicler himself was not entirely certain of the facts. The dead had indeed come when summoned, but they had not been willing to return to their rest. For 3 days and nights, the monastery had been besieged by appearances most terrible and sounds that drove men from their reason. Several monks had died, apparently of fright, and the prior himself had been found in the church at Matins, his face turned to the altar, stone dead with no mark upon him save an expression of such horror that none could bear to look upon it. The whistle had been hidden away, sealed with prayers and buried in darkness, and apparently forgotten until the dissolution, when someone, presumably the last prior, had placed it in the wooden box where Wainwright had found it. There was a final entry, dated 1539, written in English in a shaking hand. Let him who finds this know that some doors once opened cannot easily be closed. I have seen what lies beyond, and I pray God that none may see it after me. The whistle must not be sounded. The dead must not be waked. Wainwright sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. It was fascinating material, even if one discounted the supernatural elements as medieval superstition. The Black Death had driven many to extremes of religious mania. It was not surprising that the monks of Helmstone had turned to what they believed was a magical artifact. The subsequent hauntings could be explained as mass hysteria, common enough in enclosed communities under extreme stress. And yet, he thought of the whistling he had heard, the footprint on the library floor. Morse had found the whistle, had researched it as Wainwright was doing now, and had died 3 days later with an expression of horror on his face. Coincidence, surely, but Wainwright found himself locking the whistle away more carefully that night, and placing a chair against the connecting door to the library. Over the next 3 days, the manifestations increased in both frequency and intensity. It began with small things that could almost be explained away. Books that Wainwright was certain he had reshelved were found open on the reading table, always to pages dealing with death, burial, or resurrection. The temperature in the library dropped noticeably after sunset, so much so that he could see his breath even with a fire roaring in the great fireplace. And there were the sounds, not just whistling now, but whispers in what might have been Latin too faint to make out clearly but persistent enough to be maddening. On the third night, Thursday, October 19th, something happened that destroyed any lingering skepticism. Wainwright had worked late, cataloging a collection of Tudor letters, and didn't retire until nearly midnight. He had been asleep for perhaps an hour when he was awakened by the sound of his bedroom door opening. He lay still, every muscle tense, watching through half-closed eyes as a figure entered the room. It was not, as he had first feared, an intruder in the conventional sense. The figure was tall, dressed in what appeared to be a monk's habit, but there was something wrong with the way it moved. A curious gliding motion, as if its feet didn't quite touch the floor, and where its face should have been, there was only shadow despite the moonlight streaming through the window. The figure moved to the bedside table, where Wainwright had locked the whistle in the drawer. It stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, and Wainwright had the terrible sensation that it was looking at him, though it had no eyes that he could see. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it glided back toward the door. But instead of opening the door, it simply passed through it, like smoke through a keyhole. Wainwright lay rigid for several minutes more before he dared to move. When he finally sat up and lit a candle with shaking hands, he saw that the drawer of the bedside table was open. The key, which he had hidden under his pillow, was still there, but the lock had been turned nonetheless. The whistle, thankfully, remained in its box, but the box itself was covered with a thin layer of what looked like grave dust. He spent the rest of the night in a chair by the fire, the poker across his knees, starting at every sound. When dawn finally came, he seriously considered packing his bags and leaving immediately, but something, pride, perhaps, or scholarly stubbornness, kept him from running. He had come to catalogue the library, and he would finish the job, but he would also take precautions. That morning, he wrote to a colleague at Cambridge, a man named Pemberton, who had made a study of medieval superstitions and their remedies. Without going into too much detail, he asked about traditional protections against supernatural manifestations, framing it as research for a paper he was considering. He also visited the village church, ostensibly to examine the memorial brasses but actually to obtain a small amount of holy water from the font, feeling slightly foolish but determined to leave nothing to chance. The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Wainwright was working in the library, deliberately keeping his back to the corner where the whistle lay hidden, when Mrs. Jennings announced that the Reverend Dr. Marchmont had called and wished to speak with him. Marchmont was the rector of Helmstone St. Mary, a man of about 60 with the weathered face of someone who spent more time on horseback than in his study. "Dr. Wainwright," he began, after the usual pleasantries had been exchanged, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I should speak with you about your work here. Of course, has Mr. Blackwood asked you to check on the progress?" No, this is, well, it's a more delicate matter. Word has reached me that you found certain items in the library, old things that perhaps were meant to stay hidden." Wainwright studied the rector's face. The man was clearly uncomfortable, but determined to say his piece. "You're referring to the whistle. Ah, so you have found it." Marchmont sighed heavily. "I had hoped, well, no matter, Dr. Wainwright. I'm not a superstitious man. I studied at Oxford. I've read Darwin and Huxley. I consider myself a modern churchman. But there are things in this world that defy rational explanation, and that whistle is one of them." "You've seen it before?" "Not personally, no. But my predecessor left certain records, passed down from rector to rector since the Reformation. The whistle was thought to have been destroyed during the dissolution, but there were always rumors that it had been hidden instead. When poor Morse, well, when he died as he did, I wondered. And now you've confirmed my fears." Marchmont leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Dr. Wainwright, I must urge you in the strongest possible terms to leave that thing alone. Better yet, bring it to me, and let me ensure it's properly destroyed. Whatever scholarly value it might have is far outweighed by the danger it represents." "Danger? Reverend, surely you don't believe medieval superstitions about raising the dead?" "I believe," Marchmont said carefully, "that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. I also believe that Josiah Morse was a healthy man of 55 who died of fright 3 days after finding that whistle. And I know, though I cannot explain it, that every dog in the village howled on the night he died, and that the church bells rang 13 times at midnight, though no one was in the tower." Wainwright wanted to dismiss this as rural superstition, but the memory of the figure in his room was too fresh. Still, his scholarly pride rebelled against simply handing over such a significant historical artifact. "I appreciate your concern, Reverend, but I have a responsibility to properly catalogue and document all the items in this collection. However, I give you my word that I will take every precaution." Marchmont stood up, his face grave. "I pray that will be enough. But if you should change your mind, or if anything happens that alarms you, please send for me immediately, day or night. And Dr. Wainwright," he paused at the door, "whatever you do, don't blow that whistle. The old records are very clear on that point. Once it's sounded, what it summons cannot easily be sent away again." For 2 days after Marchmont's visit, Wainwright experienced a peculiar calm. The manifestations ceased, the library remained at a normal temperature, and he began to wonder if the whole episode hadn't been the product of isolation and overwork. He made good progress on the catalogue, discovering several items of genuine scholarly interest, including what appeared to be an early copy of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, with marginal notes in an 8th century hand. It was on the evening of Sunday, October 22nd, that everything changed. Wainwright had attended morning service in the village, partly to maintain appearances, partly because Marchmont's warning had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, and had spent the afternoon writing up his notes. As evening fell, he decided to make one more examination of the whistle before locking it away permanently. He wanted to make a precise drawing of the carved patterns, and to copy the inscription exactly for his records. He brought the whistle to his sitting room, where the light was better, and spent an hour with his magnifying glass, meticulously recording every detail. The patterns, he realized, were not random decorations but seemed to tell a story, figures processing toward what might be a gate or doorway, with other figures emerging from the other side. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The more he looked, the more details emerged. It was then that he made his fatal error. In examining the mouthpiece, he noticed that it was partially blocked with what looked like centuries of accumulated dust and debris. Without thinking, and this momentary lapse of judgment would haunt him for the rest of his days, he raised the whistle to his lips and blew gently, simply to clear the obstruction. The sound that emerged was unlike anything he had expected. It was not the shrill note of a penny whistle or the melodious tone of a flute, but something that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the building. It was 3 notes, rising in a minor key, and they hung in the air long after he had lowered the whistle from his lips, echoing and re-echoing, as if the priory itself had become a vast-sounding chamber. Then came the silence. Not the normal quiet of an autumn evening, but an absolute absence of sound that pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. Even the ticking of his watch seemed to have stopped. Wainwright sat frozen, the whistle still in his hand, waiting for something he couldn't name, but knew with terrible certainty was coming. The first sign was a drop in temperature so sudden and severe that his breath came out in clouds and frost began forming on the windows. Then came the sound of footsteps, not one set but many, moving in unison with the measured tread of a funeral procession. They seemed to be coming from the ruined church, growing steadily closer, though the windows showed nothing but darkness. The door to the library began to rattle in its frame, gently at first, then with increasing violence. Wainwright backed away, still clutching the whistle, as the rattling spread to the windows, the furniture, even the floor beneath his feet. Books fell from their shelves in the library beyond, their crashes adding to the cacophony, and underneath it all, growing stronger, was the sound of voices, hundreds of voices, whispering in Latin, "Vocasti nos venemus." "You called us, we come." The door to the library burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall and hung from one hinge. What entered was not one figure but a multitude, though they seemed to occupy the same space in a way that hurt to perceive. They were dressed as Benedictine monks, their habits gray with age and earth, but there was something fundamentally wrong about them. They moved in jerky, unnatural ways, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings, and where their faces should have been there were only suggestions, a gleam that might be eyes, a shadow that could be a mouth. They filled the sitting room without truly entering it, present and absent simultaneously, solid enough to block the light, but translucent enough that Wainwright could see the furniture through them. The temperature continued to plummet until ice began forming on the inside of the windows, and the smell, God, the smell was of earth and corruption, of crypts long sealed and opened again. One figure separated itself from the mass, taller than the rest, wearing what might have been a prior's insignia. It glided toward Wainwright, who found himself unable to move, paralyzed not by fear alone, but by some external force that held him as firmly as iron bands. The figure stopped just inches from him, and he could feel the cold radiating from it like an open grave in winter. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in Wainwright's chest as much as in his ears. The Latin was archaic, the pronunciation strange, but he understood it perfectly. "You have called us from our rest. What would you know?" Wainwright tried to speak but found his voice frozen in his throat. The figure tilted its head, or what passed for its head, in a gesture that might have been curiosity or mockery. "The living always seek knowledge of death," it continued, still in that ancient Latin. "But knowledge has a price. Morse paid it. The prior paid it. Will you pay it, scholar?" The paralysis released enough for Wainwright to gasp out, "I didn't mean it was an accident." A sound like laughter, but hollow and wrong, filled the room. "There are no accidents with the fistula mortis. It calls," we answer. "It has always been thus, since before your Christ walked the earth, since the old priests knew the ways between worlds." The other figures began to move, circling Wainwright in a slow procession, their whispers growing louder. He caught fragments of their words, names, dates, descriptions of deaths from plague, violence, old age. They were reciting the roll of the dead, every soul who had died in the priory since its foundation, and with each name, Wainwright felt something drain from him, as if his own life force was being pulled into their terrible orbit. "Stop," he managed to whisper. "Please stop." The tall figure leaned closer, and Wainwright caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the hood, not a face but an absence, a void that seemed to pull at his sanity. "You wish us to return, then you must close what you have opened. The whistle called us forth. The whistle must send us back. But know this, each time it is blown, the barrier grows thinner. One day it will not close at all." "How?" Wainwright's voice was barely audible. "How do I send you back?" "Blow again, with the intention of dismissal. But beware, we do not go willingly, and we leave our mark on those who summon us. Look at your hand, scholar." Wainwright looked down at his left hand, the one not holding the whistle. The skin was gray and withered, as if it had aged decades in minutes. As he stared in horror, the figure continued, "This is the beginning. Each moment we remain, you age. Choose quickly." With trembling fingers, Wainwright raised the whistle to his lips. The figures pressed closer, their whispers becoming a roar, and he could feel the years falling away from him like leaves from a dying tree. He blew 3 notes, descending this time, and put all his will into a single thought: return, go back, leave this place. The effect was immediate but not instant. The figures began to waver, their forms becoming less distinct, but they fought against the dismissal. The tall figure reached out with one spectral hand, grasping for the whistle, and where its fingers passed through Wainwright's arm, the flesh turned black with frostbite. The others pressed forward, their whispers becoming screams of rage and frustration. "You cannot hold us forever," the tall figure said, its voice now coming from very far away. "The barrier weakens. The old seals fail. We will return, with or without the calling." The room spun around Wainwright as the figures began to fade, pulled back by the dismissal, but clawing at the air as they went. Books flew from shelves, furniture overturned, and the windows cracked from the cold. He felt as if he were being pulled in two directions, toward the departing dead and toward life, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, he hung suspended between the two states. Then, suddenly, they were gone. The temperature began to rise, though slowly, and normal sounds returned. The tick of his watch, the settling of the building, his own ragged breathing. Wainwright collapsed into a chair, the whistle falling from nerveless fingers to roll across the floor. His left hand was still withered, the arm frost-bitten to the elbow, and he could feel a deep exhaustion that seemed to come from his very bones. He must have passed out, because the next thing he knew, Mrs. Jennings was shaking him awake, her face white with concern. It was morning. Somehow he had lost an entire night. Dr. Wainwright, oh thank God, we heard such sounds last night, but we couldn't get into the wing. The doors were all frozen shut. I've sent for Dr. Harrington and Reverend Marchmont. Wainwright tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He gestured weakly toward the whistle, which still lay on the floor, and Mrs. Jennings, understanding immediately, picked it up with obvious reluctance and locked it in its box. Dr. Harrington arrived within the hour, and his examination was thorough but puzzled. Severe frostbite, he muttered, examining Wainwright's arm. In October, in a heated room. And this withering, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if the arm has aged 50 years overnight. You need hospital treatment, Dr. Wainwright. Immediately. But before he could be moved, Marchmont arrived. The rector took one look at Wainwright, another at the devastated room, and understood immediately what had happened. You blew it, he said. It wasn't a question. Wainwright nodded weakly. And they came. Another nod. Marchmont turned to the others. Mrs. Jennings, Dr. Harrington, I need you to leave us for a moment. What I have to do requires privacy. When they had gone, reluctantly, Marchmont took out a small leather case from his coat. Inside were the implements of his office, a small crucifix, a vial of what was presumably holy water, and a prayer book worn with use. I'm going to perform a blessing, he said, not quite an exorcism that requires episcopal permission, but something that might help. And then we're going to destroy that damned whistle once and for all. No, Wainwright protested weakly. Historical artifact, scholarly value. Your scholarship nearly killed you, Marchmont said bluntly. And if what I fear is true, you've weakened a barrier that should never have been touched. The whistle must be destroyed. The blessing took nearly an hour, Marchmont moving through the rooms with methodical precision, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers in both Latin and English. When he reached the corner where the whistle lay, the box began to vibrate violently, and a sound like distant screaming could be heard. Marchmont didn't hesitate. He picked up the box, carried it outside to the ruins of the old church, and there on what had once been the high altar he built a fire. This should have been done 500 years ago, he said, as he placed the box in the flames. The whistle didn't burn easily. The box caught immediately, but the whistle itself seemed to resist the flames, glowing white-hot but not consuming. Strange colors played through the fire, greens and purples that had no natural place there, and once again came that terrible sound of many voices crying out in rage. But Marchmont kept feeding the fire, praying continuously, until finally, with a crack like a gunshot, the whistle split in two. The pieces crumbled to powder almost immediately, and a wind that came from nowhere scattered the ashes across the ruins. Where they fell, Wainwright noticed, the grass would later wither and die, leaving bare patches that, according to Mrs. Jennings, never grew back properly. Wainwright spent 3 weeks in hospital in Ipswich, being treated for frostbite, and what the doctors described as severe nervous exhaustion of unknown origin. His left arm never fully recovered. The hand remained withered and partially paralyzed, though he learned to write passably with his right. More disturbing were the dreams that plagued him for months afterward, dreams of endless processions of the dead, all turning to look at him with faces that weren't faces, whispering his name in languages that predated Christ. He returned to Cambridge in November, officially to convalesce, but in truth, because he could not bear to stay at Helmstone any longer. The library catalogue was completed by another scholar, a young man named Harrison, who found nothing more disturbing than some mice in the theology section. Wainwright never asked if Harrison had looked in the northeast corner behind the sermons. He didn't want to know. The physical effects of his experience were obvious. The withered arm, the streak of white hair that appeared overnight, the way he would shiver uncontrollably whenever the temperature dropped. But there were other changes, less visible but more profound. He could no longer work comfortably in archives or old libraries. The smell of ancient paper and binding glue would bring back that terrible night with visceral clarity. He abandoned his work on Benedictine monasteries and turned instead to safely modern subjects. Victorian church architecture, 19th century parish records. More disturbing still was what happened at certain times of the year. On All Souls' Day, and again on the anniversary of that terrible night in October, Wainwright would hear them. The whispers, the footsteps, the sound of a procession that never quite arrived. He would lock himself in his rooms at St. Bartholomew, stuff his ears with cotton, and drink himself into oblivion rather than listen to those sounds. His colleagues attributed his behavior to the eccentricity that often accompanies genius, never suspecting the truth. He corresponded briefly with Marchmont, who informed him that the priory had been troubled by disturbances for several months after the whistle's destruction, cold spots, unexplained sounds, and a general atmosphere that made even the stoutest hearts uneasy. Mr. Blackwood, returning from the continent, had decided to close the house and put it up for sale. It remained on the market for years, the price dropping steadily, until it was finally purchased by a London businessman who had it demolished, and the stones carted away. Even then, locals reported, the ruins of the old church remained a place where animals would not go, and where frost lingered long after spring had come. Here I must resume my own voice, having transcribed Wainwright's account as faithfully as possible. His manuscript ends rather abruptly with the demolition of Helmstone Priory, but I feel obligated to add a few details that may be of interest to the reader. Edmund Wainwright died on October 22, 1930, exactly 8 years to the day after he blew the whistle. His death was sudden and, according to the college porter who found him, disturbing. He was discovered in his study, seated at his desk with a pen in his hand, apparently having been writing a letter. The letter itself was incoherent, a rambling account of voices calling him, of debts that must be paid, of doors that once opened could never fully close. His face, the porter said, bore an expression of such profound terror that the poor man had nightmares about it for months afterward. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, which was probably true as far as it went. But those of us who knew about the manuscript, who had seen the withered arm and the haunted look that never quite left his eyes, wondered if perhaps the figures he had summoned that night in Suffolk had finally come to collect what they considered their due. I made inquiries about Helmstone Priory and discovered some curious facts. The businessman who had it demolished, a Mr. Geoffrey Pike, died within a year of completing the work, found dead in his London office with no mark upon him save an expression of utmost horror. The workmen who carried out the demolition reported numerous accidents and disturbances, and 3 of them died within the following 2 years, all under mysterious circumstances. More interesting still, I traced the stones from the priory and found that many had been sold to a builder in Norwich who used them in the construction of new houses. Every one of those houses has a history of disturbance, unexplained cold spots, sounds of footsteps where no one walks, and most tellingly, the occasional report of whistling that seems to come from within the walls themselves. I have also discovered, through correspondence with the Suffolk Record Office, that the night Wainwright died, October 22nd, 1930, was marked by strange events across the entire region. Dogs howled without cause. Church bells were heard to ring at midnight, though no one was in the towers, and several people reported seeing a procession of hooded figures walking the old Roman roads, moving toward where Helmstone Priory once stood. There is one final detail that I hesitate to include, as it may strain the reader's credulity, but I feel obligated to be complete. Last month, while organizing Wainwright's papers for donation to the college library, I found a small package that had arrived for him the day after his death. It was postmarked from Wickham Market and contained no return address. Inside was a note in a spidery hand that I recognized as belonging to Mrs. Jennings, the Priory's former housekeeper. The note read, "Dr. Wainwright, I thought you should know. They've been digging in the ruins again. Some archaeological society from London. They found something this morning in what was the old crypt. Another box, just like the first one. God help us all, there were two of them. The second whistle has been found." I made immediate inquiries, but Mrs. Jennings had died 3 years previously, and the archaeological society she mentioned seems never to have existed, at least not officially. The ruins of Helmstone Priory are now completely overgrown, avoided by locals and forgotten by historians. But sometimes, on quiet October nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, people in the villages nearby report hearing a sound that chills them to the bone, the long, low note of a whistle, calling across the centuries to summon that which should remain at rest. I have done what research I could, but I have been careful not to dig too deep. Some knowledge, as poor Wainwright learned, comes at too high a price. I publish his account now as he wished, as a warning to those who might be tempted to investigate further. Let the dead rest. Let the whistle, wherever it may be, remain unblown. And if you should ever come across a small wooden box, locked and ancient, containing what appears to be a bone whistle with Latin inscriptions, I beg you, leave it be. For as Wainwright wrote in that final, incoherent letter found on his desk, they never truly left. They wait just beyond the threshold, pressing against the barrier, seeking the smallest crack through which to return. The whistle was not a tool of summoning, but of binding, and now that it is destroyed, the binding weakens. God forgive me, I have broken a seal that should have remained whole until the end of days. Whether this is true or merely the delusion of a mind broken by terror, I leave to the reader to decide. But I will say this, since transcribing Wainwright's manuscript, I have begun to hear things in the night, whispers in a language I don't recognize, but somehow understand, footsteps in the corridor outside my rooms when I know the building is empty, and last night, as I sat working late in my study, I could have sworn I heard very faintly the sound of whistling. I pray it is only my imagination, influenced by too much immersion in Wainwright's disturbing account, but I have taken to keeping a crucifix on my desk and a vial of holy water in my pocket, just in case. For if Wainwright was right, if there really are barriers between our world and others, and if those barriers can be weakened or broken, then perhaps his story is not just a warning about one particular artifact, but about the danger of disturbing any of the old boundaries that our ancestors, in their wisdom or their fear, saw fit to establish. Let sleeping dogs lie, as the proverb has it, and let the dead, whatever form they take, remain undisturbed in their rest. End of manuscript, found among the papers of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, Fellow of St. Bartholomew's College, Cambridge, who disappeared without trace on October 22, 1931, 1 year to the day after Edmund Wainwright's death. His rooms were found in perfect order, save for one detail. On his desk was a small wooden box, recently opened, containing traces of what appeared to be bone dust. The box bore an inscription in Latin, Fistula mortis secunda, the second whistle of death. Its whereabouts remain unknown.